This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you, James. Paul's concern for his Jewish compatriots continues as we read on in this letter to Rome. Paul wants those who have discovered the righteousness that is beyond the law to be faithful witnesses to all that they have discovered. That's the only way that other people are going to find out and hear about this whole way of being. And in so many ways, we are in a similar dynamic to Paul with his Jewish context, in that we relate to others in our post-Christian context, and they need to know something that they don't appear to know. Since meeting the risen Christ, Paul had come to distinguish between his before and after approaches to righteousness. Before the encounter on the road to Damascus, Paul had been all about the law of Moses. For Paul, before his confrontation with the risen Christ, there was no righteousness apart from strict observance and adherence to the Mosaic law. That's what it was all about. A person's righteousness quotient, as it were, was directly measurable by their obedience to the code of laws for daily, weekly and seasonal rituals and behaviours. You want to know how righteous you were? How closely are you following the rules? And this wasn't only Paul's understanding, this is actually the standard religious understanding across all religions, really, about how one pleases their God or their gods. You do what your God has told you to do. What the deity, or in some cases many deities, had commanded was codified in the laws and the precepts and the rituals of the culture. This was then simply a matter of doing as you had been told. There was no discussion to be entered into, no need to engage your brain or your heart. Just do as you're instructed, please. Which, as we know, sets up a secondary dynamic wherein we can go through the motions of obedience without any depth engagement in what it is we're actually doing. Which is to say, a Jew who understood themselves to be righteous according to the law could, theoretically, complete fully every directive of the law and utterly avoid each and every prohibition, and still have absolutely no idea what they were doing, really. No appreciation about what their whole religious relationship was about. Their heart would be left unchanged through the whole process. Now, even Moses, some 4,000 years ago, knew the whole purpose was meant to be more than just a blind conformity to a code of precepts. If you read in Deuteronomy 30, which is what Paul is quoting at the beginning of the passage James just read, "For this commandment which I command you today is not too difficult for you," says Moses, "nor is it out of reach. It is not in heaven that you should say, 'Who will go up to heaven for us and get it for us and make us hear it that we may observe it?' Nor is it beyond the sea that you should say, 'Who will cross the sea for us to get it for us and make us hear it that we may observe it?' But the word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart that you may observe it." And this really is a startling pronouncement from Moses. It's as though he was saying, none of this is so strange. It's not so complicated or removed from you. You know what to do. And it will not kill you to do it either. So just get along and live this stuff well. The rules will guide you as you do it. But the rules themselves cannot do the thing that enables community flourishing. As I've said here before, rules really are designed to hold us back from our worst instincts and destroying one another, but they have no power to transform our hearts. Moses himself wanted to differentiate between transcendent rules that are forever beyond us and the faith that knows it is all about a response of love to a God who has first loved us. And this is very important, because where law and rule and precept cannot change anyone's heart, love never fails to change the heart. It transforms us. How does this transformation take place? Well, let's think about it for a moment. When we are loved, we are the recipients of an invitation to place our trust in the one who is loving us. Sounds kind of simple enough, doesn't it? But we are complex beings, and we carry all manner of echoes from our past and false ideas about what love looks like. It generally takes time for us to overcome our reactions and to learn how to respond well to genuine love. It takes time to learn to trust. The trust bit's the most challenging. That's where we sovereignly relinquish control to the power to determine outcomes. We hand that over and choose instead to enjoin our well-being with the well-being of another. I'd already been married for more than 30 years when I became deeply aware of just how self-seeking and self-protecting so many of my deepest impulses continue to be. This need not surprise anyone. We're all pretty selfish, really, each one of us, I reckon. But it stunned me how I could sustain to myself a narrative that I was a kind and loving man, yet in the central human relationship of my life, in my marriage, I harboured fears and mistruths. I lied to myself, and manipulative strategies to get what I wanted from my relationship. But so long as I fulfilled certain obligations and was careful not to step over other lines, I told myself I was pretty much justified. I was doing it all right. I tell you what, this love business is far more subtle and challenging than most of us readily realise. Living right in the eyes of God, or true righteousness, is when we enjoin our well-being with God. Mere obedience to law and precept is a way of clinging to control and is the attempt to determine the outcome for ourselves, which is why it invariably leads to a kind of self-righteousness, because it's all about ourselves from the get-go. In this approach, God features not as a person that we relate to, but simply as the adjudicator who decides if we've made the grade. If we manage to fulfill enough of the requirements, enough of the time, then we're okay. But it is irretrievably all about ourselves and our righteousness, which we have secured by our efforts. So it's quite self-centered, I reckon. And it's stunning to realise that Moses grasped something of this difference some 2,000 years before Paul quoted him in this letter, which was written 2,000 years ago. So that's a long time ago we're talking about. In this passage from Deuteronomy 30, Moses is quoted as saying, "But the word is very near you, it's in your mouth and in your heart, that you may observe it." Moses is drawing a distinction between righteousness that is beyond a person's grasp, because it requires them to attain access to God via their obedience, and requires a righteousness that is innately, he contrasts that with a righteousness that is innately accessible due to it being found in the responsiveness to the love of God in the heart of the person. So, two different sorts of righteousness. One you achieve by obedience, one you respond to God's love. So it's in your heart, that response. Moses is famously the prophet through whom the law was delivered to the people of God originally, and yet even he understood that it was a faithful response to God's initiative of love rather than any kind of blind obedience to law that really mattered. Moses himself was aware that God had first reached out to him in the encounter of the burning bush. But even before that, before Moses was conscious of anything much at all, God had been at work to rescue him from the infanticide that was happening in Egypt at the time. Lots of Jewish children were being violently executed. And the extraordinary love and ingenuity of his mother, who made a purpose-built waterproof basket and placed the baby Moses in it and sent him off down the river, where he was found and taken into the Pharaoh's daughter's family. Then Moses' birth mother was enabled to become a wet nurse for the little baby Moses, so entered in an ongoing way in Moses' life, no doubt ensuring Moses always understood his true identity. And God was at work in Moses' life well before he had the capacity to know any of that, to choose anything, much less to respond with some kind of obedience. And then we see Moses, aware of his true identity and connection with the Hebrew slaves in Egypt, inextricably drawn to stand with them. He comes to the defense of a slave who's being beaten by an Egyptian soldier, and now adult Prince Moses strikes the guard down and kills him. The next day, when Moses sees two Hebrew slaves arguing, he seeks to break up that stoush by reminding them that they are brothers and they shouldn't fight with each other. The two Hebrews recoil from Moses. They name him as the guard killer, asking whether Moses will strike them down as well if they don't pay attention to what he's saying. And Moses felt exposed and fled into the desert. None of the story of God's people is straightforward. It doesn't ever go in a straight line, I reckon. Moses spends years and years and years in the desert, in the wilderness. There he finds a partner to marry, one of the daughters of the priest of Midian, and he raises a family, a couple of sons. Then God interrupts his life as a shepherd in Midian and calls him to be instrumental in releasing the Hebrews from their slavery in Egypt. And the thing I find compelling about Moses' story is, while it was by no means straightforward, each step along the way seemed logical enough from the place that preceded it. It was God who was directing the path through this very windy course, trained and educated amongst the Egyptian elite, and then being amongst them but never really being of them, then propelled out of his relative comfort due to his fear about what he'd done in killing that soldier, to a new life so different to his upbringing and formation that it becomes for Moses a kind of reformation of his sense of who he was. He becomes a shepherd in the wilderness area. Moses learns how to keep an eye on a flock and how to navigate the desert, skills that would come to the fore when God calls him to save the people. For Moses, one thing builds upon another. He was being led, all while being authentic to what was in his heart to do and to be. The word that came from God was at the same time the word that was on Moses' heart, in one sense. And even when Moses objected because he didn't feel capable of addressing the people or the Pharaoh because of all the things that had happened well back in his past, God gave him his brother Aaron to be his mouthpiece, and all of that was overcome. Which is not the same thing as saying Moses was just a great man who achieved great things, and so in hindsight we claim that God was involved. No, there's no way anyone, not the Pharaoh, not Moses' mother, not the feuding Hebrew slaves, not the priest of Midian whose daughter Moses married, and not Aaron, Moses' brother, least of all Moses himself, could have orchestrated the twists and turns that led to the extraordinary happenings of the Exodus. Moses' story was a remarkable story of supernatural outcomes and interventions that no one should have expected under normal circumstances. And strangely, Paul's story is kind of similar. A man whose heart was set on eradicating the Jesus followers became the foremost and by far the most effective of all of them. It is faith in the God who brings about these supernatural happenings in the real world that Paul is championing. All of the miracles of all the miracles that could be done, certainly the greatest and the one that is most beyond our nature is summed up in this: whoever believes in him will not be disappointed, for there is no distinction between Jew and Greek. For the same Lord is Lord of all, abounding in riches for all who call on him. For whoever will call on the name of the Lord will be saved. This is so counter to everything within us. At Wayside, they put it more simply. They say a community with no us and them. Everyone is accepted. Love is championed over hate. And this substantial truth is so foreign to our evolved tribal ways of being that we need to see it lived in order to come to understand it, let alone to believe that it could even ever be a real possibility. You know, here in Australia, since the beginnings of European settlement, we have introduced a culture that is broadly understood as the rule of law under a parliamentary system, parliamentary democracy, which is to say a framework is imposed to hold and stabilise the otherwise very diverse culture and society that is Australia. And this has worked pretty well for the vast majority of the people most of the time. Certainly there have been institutionalised racism at the margins. How much can we expect a system to transform the hearts of people? And in a sense, this is precisely the point. Paul is not referring to a system of enforced constraints that restrict the expression of our innate xenophobia. Paul knows that coming into a living, loving relationship with the most gracious eternal God has the power to transform any xenophobia into curiosity and care, which at the same time amounts to becoming the more humane and at its base level, the more human. But how is anyone going to know any of this if the people it has been entrusted to fail to live it and fail to share it? Here it is not simply the persuasive nature of lives lived in love that matter, as much as they do matter. Don't get me wrong, our lives will either serve to confirm or to contradict what we say that we believe. It is, however, also crucial that we find the capacity to give voice to what we believe, to testify regarding our convictions. And this is where it can become a bit trickier for some of us, particularly in a church as broad as the Uniting Church, because we fear our personal convictions might be found offensive by others. The inadvertent consequence sometimes seems to be that we work on avoiding developing any convictions at all. But in a world that's constantly changing and evolving in terms of its politics and economics and the technologies we use every day and media and streams of information that we receive, and all the more subtly, the subtext of what really matters most to all of us, how do we develop convictions that are sufficiently true to withstand the erosion of the constant tides of change? And I tell you what, the stories of Scripture serve us extremely well in this regard. Ian and I have been talking about this, and just hearing those stories and living in them, they do something in us. The beauty and power of the stories of Scripture, even though they're so distant from us in time and place and culture, continue to transform us as we listen in on them and participate with them. That's how we are transformed, I reckon. A while ago, when a young couple who were formerly locals to Ultimo tragically lost their 1-year-old child, it was the leaven of the existing relationship I and my family already had with this young couple that meant it was not only possible but quite natural for me to reach out to them to see if I could help. It was a pre-existing relationship that made it easier for them to allow me into their respective distress. However, words appropriate to the circumstances, were also required. It wasn't just a matter of being loving. Being with people is most certainly foundational. That's how we connect. And I would never suggest that it should be contrived or artificial. There's got to be genuine relationship. But the circumstances of the tragedy that I was entering into with this young couple, all that they had lost, meant that new meaning making was required in that situation. Specific and well-chosen words were essential, not pleasant platitudes. They wouldn't cut it. Certainly not opportunistic manipulations while they were vulnerable. True words of a substantive hope that would offer a way forward into a renewed life. The name of Jesus was not uttered very often in our many conversations. He did feature. But more than that, his truth and lived presence was all through our tender interactions over many months. And this young couple, with now their newly born second child, are taking on their life with grace and dignity and hope. It's a true miracle, I believe. They've responded to the substantive call of Christ to live beyond themselves, to live beyond their loss, to live beyond their pain, and to live into a hope for the future. Now, more words are needed there for them and with them, and I will never use those words manipulative or coercively, but they now know something of resurrection from the inside of their hearts. They have lived a form of resurrection, and I'm confident it's only a matter of time until they realise the resonance of their story with that of the gospel story. Paul wants the Christians in Rome, and indeed everywhere, to be ready both to live and to tell the story of the risen Jesus. He wants others to know and to become persuaded, just as he himself had come to know and to be persuaded. Paul knew this truth about the risen Christ was the only hope for all people, and indeed for the whole world. The Jew first, and then the Greek, but also the barbarian, the slave, the free, the men, the women, and honestly every other category we might be ingenious enough to come up with. But with Paul, I encourage you to continue to explore and understand and respond to the call of Christ. It is through us and other Christian people that the risen Jesus now lives in our communities and in our relationships. It is in our embodied grace and our articulated truth and hope that people meet him. There has never been a greater need for this truth and love to be clearly lived and presented to our world. That is our calling and our challenge and our privilege and the glory of God. Amen.